Hi friends, if you watched my video last week, you'll know that I've recently received a Comamio grain mill and I've been having a lot of fun testing it out, trying different recipes, experimenting. And today I wanted to show you the very first time that I made bread with freshly ground flour. Now it is a totally different ball game than making normal sourdough bread with all-purpose flour or bread flour. However, it does work and it is delicious, and I just wanted to share a few things that I learnt over this process. I did quite a lot of research, listening to lots of different podcasts and watching videos before I started with my grain mill, and there was a lot of contradicting advice, so I still don't really know what the best way forward is. But the bread that I made was successful the very first time, and I wanted to show you what I did. So the first thing that I do differently when I use freshly milled flour is that I soak the grain. This is called Autolyse. So I added the water to the freshly milled flour and let that sit for between 30 minutes and an hour. I made another loaf of bread after this, and I skipped this step, and the result was definitely not as good. So I really do recommend soaking your flour before you add anything else, before you add the salt and before you add the starter. I'm making two different types of bread today, a sandwich loaf which I've just put together, that's the one with the green tea towel, and a sourdough artisan loaf which is the one with the pink tea towel, and you'll see me bring those out several times over the video. The other thing that I'm making is blueberry muffins. Now these are the very first thing that I made the very day that I got my grain mill, and you can see that again in the last video. Those muffins that I made the first time were not a success. I think that might be because I forgot to put an egg in there, which would explain a lot. So today I'm giving it another go. I'm trying a different recipe, and I'm using the sourdough blueberry muffin recipe over on farmhouseonboone.com, which I'll link below in the description box. Again, these muffins were not a huge success. I found them quite dry, so I still need to adapt my recipe, and I will hopefully have a recipe for freshly milled flour muffins that works over on the blog very soon, so keep your eye out for that. I'll let you know when it's out. I made a couple of changes to this recipe. The first thing that I did differently was that I used einkorn flour that was freshly milled. So that does change things a little bit. Einkorn does not absorb water the same way as wheat does. However, it has a much lower gluten content, so for my boys who are sensitive to gluten, it's a much better choice to start off with. The other things that I did differently is that I used olive oil instead of butter, but I put exactly the same amount in, so 8 tablespoons of olive oil. And I also used honey instead of sugar, and I put 3/4 of a cup of honey in there. So I'm going to be able to add those wet ingredients to the dry ingredients. So here I've got my freshly milled flour, some cinnamon, baking soda, a little bit of salt, and then I'm going to be adding the olive oil, egg, sourdough discard, vanilla and honey mixture. Mix that up really well, and then I'm going to be adding the blueberries. Now the advantage of making sourdough muffins is that you can let it ferment, which will improve the digestibility of the gluten. So that's what I did here. I popped them in the fridge for just an hour. You could do it longer. Since then I've fermented some muffin dough for 24 hours almost, and they turned out really well. So if gluten is an issue for you, you might find that that helps. Now I'm on to adding the rest of the ingredients to my bread doughs. So this is the artisan loaf. I'm adding my starter and I'm adding the salt. So for this loaf, I used 500 grams of freshly milled wheat flour, 370 grams of water, 120 grams of starter, and 10 grams of salt. And as you can see, the dough is not wet at all, even though that's an awful lot of water. It's a lot more than I would normally put in if I was making this with shop bought whole wheat flour. So freshly milled flour definitely does absorb water a lot more than shop bought. Now for this sandwich loaf, I'm not going to share the recipe with you because it was not a success, unfortunately. I put too much water in there, and with the egg and everything else, it just was too much liquid, and it was really sticky, really difficult to work with, and it ended up having quite a claggy texture to eat as well. And I also put too much honey in there. I can't remember where I got the recipe from, unfortunately, so I can't tell you if I made changes to this or if I actually followed the recipe. I'm sorry about that. But in any case, I definitely need to reduce the amount of liquid in this recipe. I need to work on this one because my family does like sandwich bread. They like the little bit sweet flavour. They don't like it too sweet, but they do like it to be a little bit sweet and have that shape that's good for sandwiches too. So I'm going to be working on this, and when I get a recipe I'm happy with, I will definitely share it with you. Now back to these muffins. They've been in the fridge for an hour and it's time to bake them. So I poured the batter into these muffin cases, and I'm going to bake them in the oven at 180 degrees Celsius for 18 to 20 minutes. And you need to keep an eye on them. They might take a little bit longer if they've been in the fridge. I like to check that they're done using a metal skewer, and if it comes out with batter on it, then you'll know that it needs to carry on cooking for a little while. Make sure you don't overcook them, otherwise they will be dry. Throughout the day I was doing stretch and folds, and you can really tell how the batter is changing throughout these different stretch and folds. Even this really wet sandwich dough is starting to come together. It's still very sticky, but it's holding together well. So I am going to be able to get a loaf of bread out of it, even though it's not going to be the best. This is the third stretch and fold, and it's looking really good. This is a really nice bread dough for this artisan loaf. I usually like to do stretch and folds every 30 minutes to an hour, but if I know that I'm going to be going out, I might do it every 20 minutes just to make sure I get a few in before I have to go out. Or else if I'm out, then it might be an hour and a half before I get to do another stretch and fold. It really depends. I don't let sourdough rule my life. I try and fit it in with what I've got going on, and it always works out. So don't worry about having to be home to do stretch and folds all the time. Even if you don't only manage to get 1 or 2 stretch and folds in, it will still work and you'll still end up with a really good loaf of bread. Now, one of the most contradictory pieces of advice that I heard about freshly milled flour and sourdough bread is that some people say that you need to do a load of stretch and folds or else leave it in your stand mixer for 15 minutes kneading. Other people say that the bran in the freshly milled flour actually cuts through the gluten, preventing it from creating those air pockets, which will give you a fluffy loaf of bread. I don't know what the answer is. I went with the loads and loads of stretch and folds for this bread, and I think it turned out pretty well. It wasn't fluffy by any stretch of the imagination, but we're not particularly used to fluffy bread, so we enjoyed it. We like that consistent, dense bread, especially with cheese. I think it's really good. So it didn't really bother us. If you're looking for a really fluffy loaf of bread, you might want to try that no knead recipe and see how that works. In fact, I might try it out the next time too. It certainly will be easier and less time consuming to do it that way. So I've shaped the artisan loaf and put it in the Bannerton basket. I didn't show you shaping the sandwich loaf. It really is not working out well for me today, this sandwich loaf. Anyway, I managed to get it in the loaf pan. I didn't put it in the right way, so it's not going to look amazing, but it tastes okay. And this is later on that same day, because another thing that I heard about freshly milled flour is that it ferments really quickly and gets a very sour taste very quickly. So I decided that I was going to do a short fridge rise which is why scoring it is a little bit difficult. When you can leave it in the fridge overnight, you get a nice crust on the loaf and it's a lot easier to score. This one I decided to do it the same day. I baked it in the evening and it turned out really well. It rose very well. The flavour was not too sour. It tasted really good. And you can see it's got a really good oven spring to it. You can't see the scoring particularly well, but the oven spring is very good. And this is what it looks like on the inside. As you can see, it's quite dense. There's not an awful lot of air pockets in there. But again, the flavour's excellent and we don't mind that texture. This is how the sandwich loaf turned out. Because it was a wetter dough, there are more air bubbles in there. So I definitely need to adjust this recipe to try and get those air bubbles in there, but have it less wet, because I don't know if you could tell on the bottom, you could tell it was a little bit soggy. And these are the muffins that I made, a little bit dense for my liking, but still really good.